I want to talk about what's the next thing I want to talk about? Okay, you know what? Let's talk about Scott Pilgrim. Let's talk about Scott Pilgrim. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off specifically. So I wanna preface this by saying that I have to spoiler this. I have to like spoiler warning this pretty hard. In a second. We won't get off to it. I will say, so this thing was marketed as it was marketed as a comic accurate adaptation of the source material. I will say that if you have not watched if you haven't watched or read Scott Pilgrim before, you should not watch the anime. You should not watch it. It won't make sense to you. You'll be confused. It will be extremely unsatisfying and weird. I would say you should at least have seen the movie before you watch the anime. I think optimally you would have seen the movie and read the comic beforehand to get the most out of it. And that is the end of my non-spoiler thing, because you can't talk about this without spoiling it. So yeah, that's it. Go read the comic. Go watch the movie. They're great. I like the comic more, but they're great. And then you can go watch the show, and you will probably have a great time with it, because we had a great time with it. So spoiler section starts now. So this is not an adaptation of Scott Pilgrim, the comic book, nor the movie. This is essentially the closest thing you could get to making a sequel without actually making a sequel. I've heard people compare it to things like Rebuild of Evangelion, which I haven't watched. I would also describe it as it's the disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya. So, the first episode of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off we were watching it, and it follows the comic. It's following the comic, right? You're getting the scenes, but there's some stuff that's switched around. Like, it opens with them, I think, it's like the band practice, and Knives is already there. You don't get the scene which is at the start of the movie and the comic, which is Scott going to meet Knives at her school, and you get introduced to that. You start out with the band thing, and then you don't get the scene of Scott seeing Ramona at the library. He just sees her at the party. The exchange they have is based off of... we have a new exchange. I forget what the original one in the comic was. In the movie, he tells her about Pac-Man, and in the anime, he tells her about how there were two Sonic the Hedgehog cartoons where Sonic was voiced by Jaleel White. And then it kind of proceeds as normal, but we're like, oh, it's not a battle. It's like you get to the scene of the first fight with Matthew Patel, but it's not a battle of the bands. It's just a concert, and their opener flaked on them. And then I'm like, okay, that's different. And there's just things that aren't happening. And I'm like, so did they get shifted around? Because according to Kat, this was from what Brian Lee O'Malley said, there was going to be changes. I'm like, okay, but how many changes could there be? Because I was like, it's probably going to be the whole comic, because Gideon is in the trailer and he only appears in volume 6, right? The last volume. And then the fight with Matthew happens and Scott Pilgrim dies. And we're like, what? That's weird. And it isn't like immediately rectified. It the episode keeps going, and everyone leaves, and Matthew's like, what? Okay, I guess I won. And then he leaves, and we're like, what? That's interesting. And then the second episode starts up, and it's a funeral for Scott Pilgrim, where, we're like, what? What is going on? Wait, what is this? And they go up to the casket, and I'm like, what if they just... Because he, disappears into coins, And we're like, what if they just put the coins in there? And the next shot is the coins in the casket. It's like an open casket funeral. I was like, and then like Envy shows up, and we're like, wait, what is happening? And she does like a performance at his fucking funeral. And we're like, what the fuck is going on? And then transition to the League of Evil X's at Gideon's headquarters. And they have this whole fight scene where Matthew Patel is like fighting Gideon for control of his corporation, and he wins, and Gideon like goes back to Toronto, and you're like, whoa. We spent the first episode, we left on like a confusion. Second episode was like deeply confused, like we did not know what was going on. We were like, it looks cool, but like the fight scenes and everything it's cool, and there's some funny jokes. We just don't know what's happening. And then by the third episode, I feel like it really kicks off. There's 8 episodes, right? So Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is called such because Scott Pilgrim takes the fuck off. He is in less than half of the show. It's not a show about Scott Pilgrim. It is essentially the original story, like a weird fusion of the comic and the movie, but it's a what-if scenario if Scott Pilgrim disappeared after the fight with Matthew Patel. And everyone thinks that he's dead, but Ramona thinks that he's alive and he's been kidnapped. And she goes Columbo. She goes full Columbo, which they directly reference, trying to find leads on him. And by doing this, she meets all the other characters, reconnects with her exes, and essentially goes through her character arc, but herself. And Scott ends up, back at the end, and he has a little arc as well. But it's essentially like, what if Ramona was the main character of Scott Pilgrim versus the world? It's Ramona Flowers versus the world. And we loved it. We loved it. There's a lot of people who are very disappointed, and I understand it, This was marketed as a 1-to-1 adaptation of the comic, with maybe a few tweaks here and there, but basically the storyline of the comic. And it ends up being something completely different. And if that disappointment is too much for you, I can understand that, but I think for what it is, we absolutely loved it. It's essentially because, okay, when I was sad after I finished the comic because I loved it so much and it was over, and I loved the characters and I wanted to see more of them, but the way that it ends is it's too perfect. I wouldn't want there to be a follow-up to that story. Like, those last couple pages have this real, like sense of magic to them. And there's this real, like tender sensation that I get when I think about the ending of that comic. And I just leaving it as it is, kind of open-ended, kind of ambiguous, but leaving it like that is, I feel like I wouldn't want that to be changed. If you were to make a follow-up to it, even one that was like, way in the future, when they're like adults and stuff. Well, more adults. They're more of adults. It feels like just knowing would kind of violate the sort of the specialness of that ending. The magic. And so that's why that's why I'm torn, right? This is basically, when I say it's the closest you could get to a sequel, it's because it's about everyone but Scott Pilgrim. It's about all of these other great side characters, all of the exes. They get way more development because the original story is very centered around Scott, and that's for good reason. It was basically written based off of Brian Lee O'Malley's life and experiences. And Scott Pilgrim's journey as a person is in some way a reflection of his own development as a person. So in the original everything is Scott is an unreliable narrator, and the things that you see and the information that you're given are all kind of warped through his worldview and what he's paying attention to. There's whole big moments in characters' lives that he is technically around for, but you never see them until, like, you just hear he learns about them way afterwards, which is when you as the audience learns about it. And like when Steven just tells him, like, oh yeah, I realized I was gay around volume 3, and he's like, what, you didn't tell me? He's like, I mean, everyone knows it. You just weren't paying attention. Like you were just, dealing with some other stuff. So I just never really brought it up to you, but everyone knows. And so it's like, what? And just other points where you realize that Scott's version of events are maybe not the most accurate, because of, like, his sort of self-centered worldview, and his naivete, right? So removing him from the equation kind of lets the other characters really shine. It's focused on all the other characters, and they're all delightful. Ramona is great. It's nice to see her having a more, because in the original comic, like, she's around, but she's not much of an active participant, which is sort of like, it's part of the point of her character, is she kind of just creates problems for other people. In this, she's solving problems. Scott's disappearance leads her to be more of an active force in her own life. And that ends up with her resolving a bunch of issues she had with other people and just going through a character arc, which I thought was cool. Wallace gets a ton of play in this, which is epic because he's my favorite character. Wallace is so good. He's the best, dude. He is absolutely the best. He gets so many good moments. There's an entire episode where a major conflict is just caused by the fact that Wallace and Todd keep fucking. They just won't stop having crazy gay sex. So you still get Todd cheating on Envy, but it's with Wallace, which is really funny. Oh, there's so many good lines. There's so much funny shit. I love Neil, whose actor does a great job with a character who didn't really have that much to do in the original. He's just kind of there. He exists to be not Scott. And for Knives to date, essentially. He exists for Knives to date after Scott breaks up with her. But his voice actor, I love the spin he took on Neil's character, where he's always kind of like this, and he's just sort of like, oh, he's just he's out to lunch on everything. The moment where he's, oh, this is my favorite part of a whodunit, and Kim says it's called a whodunit, and he goes, no, I'm whodunit. No, who did it is the correct grammar. I should know. I used to be a writer. Oh, there's that line where Gideon is standing in the rain in front of Julie's house, and he's talking about how hard he's fallen, and he says, I couldn't even get a reservation at McDonald's. When I called them, they just laughed at me. Oh, the show is just full of these great jokes and moments, and it's just the Scott Pilgrim characters in funny situations doing funny shit. I thought it had a great kind of heart, and I don't know, so many cool segments when there's the fight scene between Ramona and Roxy, where they're in a video store, and the shelf falls over onto them, and they end up in a movie, and they keep, as they're fighting, they knock each other into different films. So fun, such a great scene. There's an element in this movie that is sort of new and sort of reflective of Brian Lee O'Malley, which is something that I wasn't aware of, but eventually they reveal that Scott was kidnapped by his future self, who is trying to prevent himself from getting with Ramona, because they end up getting divorced in the future. And I like that they don't tell you, okay, because this is not the comic, I'm okay with it, and it's like a different version of the story. So I can kind of like leave the comic to be its own thing. It's its own timeline and version of events. But so I like that they don't tell you, even if they tell you that they get divorced in the future, I like that they don't tell you why. And both of them kind of assume that it was the other's fault, but maybe it was more Scott's. And apparently Brian Lee O'Malley himself went through a divorce, which so this is kind of like a weird reflection on his own divorce and maybe the ways that he was in the wrong for certain stuff. Clearly very personal, and still like the character of Scott kind of going through him. But it's like, yeah, it's what if future Scott is almost like Nega Scott, or like Scott if he never changed, is sort of like how you could think of it. It's like Scott if he didn't actually get over himself or something, or if he went back to how if he regressed as a person. And I thought that stuff was interesting. I don't know, it was just such a really well animated. I saw some people complaining about the kind of forced out of focus shots, which I didn't find too aggravating, but it was like, okay, this is like a weird visual component. Just really, I don't know, man. I just had a great time. It was, there was so much funny, interesting, weird stuff in it. I think that it's a love letter to the characters of Scott Pilgrim without it feeling like overindulgent. I think you can run the risk of getting kind of like, when you do something like that, you can kind of run the risk of being, how would I describe it? A little too much, just sort of pushing it. There's a specific example I can think of in part 7 of JoJo's that I don't want to get into because it's like near the end and it's a real spoiler thing and it deserves its own discussion, I think. Unless I've already talked about it. I don't think I have. And that's an example where I'm like, this is way too fan servicey for me, and it feels like it's detracting from the actual plot. This does not get into that, in my opinion. This is like, yeah, it's doing, because, man, it's so good. I really liked it. We had a really good time. We were confused. We were surprised. We were constantly asking, like, wondering what was going to happen and theorizing about what was going on. And there's so many fun twists. It was great. But I would not recommend this to someone who is not familiar with the original. And like, this is the greatest prank of all time. The way that this was marketed compared to what it actually is, I find really funny. But there are a lot of people I know who have never engaged with Scott Pilgrim, who have heard about it and like, oh, I might like, there's that anime coming out soon. That's going to be like a comic, like a 1-to-1 adaptation of the comic. I'll just wait for that. And they're going to fucking get, that's probably not going to be a great experience. But for what it is, and from my perspective as someone who's consumed the other two versions of the story, I had a wonderful time with it and I got a lot out of it. I appreciated it a lot. There's a lot of sweet moments. A lot of, like, we were laughing our fucking asses off at so much of this show. Yeah, I would recommend. That's who I would if you've already watched it, it is absolutely worth checking out. There's also people who on the other side of the coin have already, they're already over the comic, or they've already read it and they weren't interested maybe in just another version of the same story. Because that's the thing, is going into this, I was thinking, okay, you had the original comic and then you've got the movie. And the movie is, as I would describe it in simple terms, the same plot, basically the same plot, but a different story because of the things that they had to cut out, or the things that they shifted around, or things that literally weren't written into the comic. when they were writing the movie. And so I was curious, all right, which side is this going to end up on? Is this going to be the safe thing would be to just adapt the comic, right? Which, to be honest, I would still appreciate. If they made another follow-up to this and it was an actual version of the comic, I'd love it. I love the comic. It would be really cool to get that in animation. It would be cool to capture that in a animated form. That would be great. But for what we got, it's a different story with a different plot. It is something unlike any other adaptation. It's not an adaptation, and I had a great time with it. And it's something that, we finished the show, and I was saying, I wouldn't want to see a sequel to the comic, but this, I wouldn't mind another season of, because it feels like it's written in a specific way where, because it's a different timeline, it's a different version of events, the characters at the end, like, okay, here's a problem with writing a sequel to Scott Pilgrim, the original, is that, like, all the evil exes are dead. Except for Roxy, and I think the twins? Does Gideon die? I forget if he actually dies. But, like, a lot of those characters are just, like, dead in the Scott Pilgrim sense, where they just kind of disappear into coins, because everything's sort of not real. But at the end of this, it's like all these characters are still around, They're still around. They're starting new chapters in their lives or get some kind of closure on something. Lucas loses his acting career. And starts working at the coffee shop. Todd gets back into veganism. Just like all these characters, they're still doing stuff. There's a group, like, we popped off when Wallace is visiting France and he meets Mobile. Oh, it's Mobile! And and there is a sequel tease. There's a sequel tease at the end. If there's another season, I wouldn't mind it. I would love if it's the same team coming back. And it would be hard to get all these people back in the booth again, because the cast is so star-studded. But if they were to do it and they were to get, Brian Lee O'Malley, if it was this whole same cast and crew, I'd love to see what another just version of Scott Pilgrim, a sequel would be like. I think that could be interesting. It's basically its own thing, and for that reason, I appreciate it. And it was honestly, I think it's the brave decision to make, right? The 1-to-1 adaptation would have been the safe option, but this is something that I can respect, I would, not that I wouldn't respect the other thing, but, I think it was pretty ballsy of them to go all out like that on this concept, and they commit to it really hard. Yeah, I would give it a thumbs up. It gets a thumbs up from the Tigster. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Like, dude, we got to the 4th episode and I was like, is it called Scott Pilgrim Takes Off because he's just gone? I legitimately think that that's the joke. That's why it's called that.